A mystery that cannot be explained. An enigma that defies reason. A surprising and unexpected answer. To encounter such a mystery firsthand may change your life forever. Face to face with the greatest riddles of the ages, the world's most profound mysteries reach out and touch your life in ways you never imagined possible. Extreme Mysteries.
The tiny nation of Israel, centuries old as a people, but barely 2 decades old as a modern nation, somehow managed to achieve one of the most stunning military victories of all time in 1967. Over a period of just 6 days, Israel fought on 3 fronts and overcame enemy forces that outnumbered them 2-1. Was this stunning victory a result of superior military planning, or was something else involved? Could it be that something in the history of this embattled nation tipped the scales in Israel's favor? Given the modern machinery of warfare, how could such a miraculous victory be possible? Is the present turmoil in the Middle East a direct result of that victory? And could it perhaps be setting the stage for history to repeat itself? Was Israel's victory in the 6 Days' War a military marvel or a miracle? The surprising answers when we come back. In late May of 1967, Egyptian President Nasser had been given what he believed to be reliable information about Israeli troop movements that informed him that Israel was massing troops on the Syrian border, an action that Egypt could not tolerate. But the surprising source of this information, which proved to be completely false, was none other than Egypt's ally, the Soviet Union.
Perhaps the least known aspect of all this conspiracy theory is the involvement of the Soviet Union. The historical records show that the Soviet Union deliberately gave the Egyptians false information about Israeli troops massing on the Syrian border. They calculated that this would provoke a response from Nasser, and apparently that's exactly what they wanted.
Some Egyptians believe the Soviets planted false reports of Israeli troop concentrations with them in order to show them how much they depended on the Soviets. From the Israeli point of view, there are some who believe that this was an attempt by the Soviets to start a war which would result in the destruction of Israel.
The reason that the Russians supplied false information to the Egyptians is because this was an opportunity to achieve their objective to dominate the Middle East. Israel was a mini superpower in that area, and so they felt they could control the Arab nations, so they supplied all of the weapons, the tanks, the planes, and trainers to accomplish this task to dominate that area.
To this day, senior former Soviet officials insist that it was not they who gave that information to the Egyptians, but the Egyptians who gave it to them. Having said that, though, one can see how the Soviet Union in the 1960s had an interest in fomenting unrest in the Middle East and opening a second front against the West in addition to Vietnam.
The plan worked perfectly. When Egypt received the false reports from the Soviets, Nasser immediately began massing troops on the Syrian border. This not only diverted his attention from air bases in the Egyptian interior, it also gave Israel an excuse to launch a preemptive first airstrike, which gave them a huge head start in winning the war. This, of course, is only a conspiracy theory, and even if it were true, it still doesn't explain why Egypt failed to respond to what turned out to be Israel's first devastating blow, a preemptive strike against Egyptian air power.
Egypt failed to respond because its air force had been destroyed on the ground in the first few hours of the fighting. The Egyptians had not struck first because they'd been under intense pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union not to do so.
There's speculation that the Americans then informed Israel that Egypt had been hemmed in. The two nations agreed that if Israel was to have any chance of surviving, they would have to strike first, while the Egyptians' hands were tied.
Both Israel and the United States have denied that they were involved in any plot in 1967. The Russians, on the other hand, have acknowledged that they passed false information to Egypt about Israel's activity on the Syrian border. But they, too, continue to deny any conspiracy against Nasser. We may never know for sure if there were secret deals that contributed to the Arabs' defeat in the Six-Day War. But even if there were some truth to these theories, it would fail to explain the many other mysterious events that happened in the midst of the battle. Like the day the Israelis began their ground invasion of the heavily fortified Sinai Peninsula. When this event occurred, the war was well underway. There was no reason for the Arabs to hold back their hostilities. So why did they let the Israelis take Khan Yunis so easily?
As the Israeli tanks moved into the Sinai Peninsula, the Egyptians seemed to be playing right into their hands. For example, there are accounts of the Egyptian tanks fleeing without being hit or firing around. Even stranger were the unexplained desertions of surface-to-air missile bases. The Egyptians abandoned military hardware, most of it Russian-made, worth well over $1 billion. Even complex radar guidance equipment had been left in operational order.
It's not unusual for troops to retreat in the face of an advancing army. What is unusual is for thousands of troops to leave behind massive amounts of military material, billions of dollars worth, without any attempt to disable that material. This happened several times during the course of the Six-Day War.
What made the enemy withdraw so quickly? Is it possible that they had experienced something so frightening that they had to retreat, even before they could make sure their own weapons did not fall into enemy hands? And do these events suggest that Israel had some kind of secret weapon that helped them win the war?
After their defeat in the Six-Day War, the Arab leaders were criticized by their friends and allies. How come their armies were defeated so easily, so quickly by the Israeli defense or combat forces? Political and military leaders of the Arab states claimed after the war that the Israelis used secret weapons.
Egyptian President Nasser continued to blame Egypt's defeat on American intervention in the conflict. So, is it possible that the United States furnished Israel with a secret weapon and kept it quiet for all these years?
Well, it's certainly not unusual for a weapon of mass destruction to turn the tide of war. And we all know that the atomic bomb is a perfect example. During World War II, the Japanese had vowed to fight unto the death. But when the United States unleashed their nuclear power on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese had no choice but to surrender. Of course, when the United States dropped the atomic bomb, it was no longer a secret, and it proved that the United States not only had it, but was ready to use it.
But what kind of secret weapon could Israel have unleashed in complete silence upon the Arabs? If such a thing were possible, it wouldn't be the first time in the history of this embattled nation.
The biblical writings are filled with many battles. Battles that in the main the Israelites won. They won them not because they were more numerous than their enemies, not because they were stronger than their enemies, but because they had a very important secret weapon. The Ark of the Covenant. To the Israelites, this was the dwelling place of God. Perhaps the best known example of the Ark's power in battle comes to us from the book of Joshua and the conquest of Jericho. The Lord told Joshua to have the soldiers march around the city for 6 days and to carry the Ark of the Covenant before them. On the seventh day, they marched around the city again. But this time, the priests blew the ram's horns, and the walls of Jericho, as we all know, came tumbling down.
The Ark of the Covenant was lost thousands of years ago, so there's no way it could have played a part in the victory. But I think if there was a secret weapon, it was most likely supplied by the United States.
The Americans probably supplied some intelligence information to the Israelis, but they categorically deny that they did anything more than that. Allegations that there was a secret weapon of some sort were completely unfounded.
Though the Arabs have sometimes claimed that Israel had a secret weapon that decided the course of the war, in fact, Israel had no large-scale secret nuclear atomic weapons. It did, however, utilize certain innovative, formerly secret weapons in its attacks. In the Battle of Jerusalem, for example, Israeli bunkers, which were facing Jordanian bunkers, were equipped with a secret surface-to-surface missile that was pre-sighted. The minute the Jordanians began firing on Israeli West Jerusalem, these missiles were launched, and all the Jordanian bunkers, in a matter of minutes, were knocked out.
If conspiracy theories cannot explain the Israelis' astonishing victory in the Six-Day War, and there was no secret weapon, we must look for another option. After the war, Israeli General Hod provided this explanation. He said, "When our nation is pushed to the wall, it rises up and lashes out tenfold. This spirit is the secret weapon of Israel's people." The strength and courage of the Israeli people certainly had a lot to do with their miraculous victory. Could it be that there was another force at work in the conflict? A supernatural force? Is it possible that the great prophets of Israel's past were about to be given their due? And who would confirm such miraculous intervention? The Israelis or the Arabs? For thousands of years, the Jewish people have been scattered among the often hostile nations of the world. Yet a common hope and a common heritage held them together, even though the faith and stamina of the Jewish people were tested to the breaking point and beyond. Perhaps because of this, the collective spirit and resolve of the Israelis has been hardened into iron, making them one of the fiercest warriors on earth. Does this explain how they overcame tremendous odds to win the Six-Day War? Perhaps, but there may also be another explanation.
I'm convinced that there was divine intervention in the Six-Day War. When you compare the two armies and see the size of the number of soldiers as well as the buildup of machinery, you know that it couldn't have possibly happened without some outside help.
Israel was one nation against a sea of Arab states. It certainly looked as if we would lose, hands down, and cease being a nation amongst nations. When we won, and especially when we liberated the holy city of Jerusalem, there was no question in our minds that this was a war, a victory designed by God.
There are several events that took place during the Six-Day War that are very difficult to explain. They seem to be in the area of the supernatural rather than the natural. They always seem to be working in favor of Israel. A female corporal was riding in a jeep with the regimental commander of an armor unit when she saw immediately in their path a tremendous fire that leaped up. The commander could see nothing, and the girl, thinking his sand goggles were covered with dust, yelled to him to swerve aside. He was convinced of danger because he knew the girl well enough to trust her judgment, though he couldn't see anything in their path. Still, he swung away into another opening that appeared between the sand dunes. The column of vehicles behind them followed. Only one jeep continued on the original path. All of a sudden, there was a terrific explosion in fire. The jeep that had stayed on the road had driven straight into an Egyptian minefield.
Is this just a fortuitous example of the desert sand playing tricks on someone's eyes? Or did the corporal actually see a vision that warned her of the danger ahead? More importantly, why was this war filled with so many examples of unexplained events that worked in Israel's favor?
Another great miracle happened in Sinai when an Israeli soldier which lost his unit was alone in the area, suddenly saw a unit of Egyptians, military unit of thousands of Egyptians. And suddenly when they saw him, they lifted their hands up. They walked to him, ready that he would take them to captivity. He was surprised, he did not believe what he saw in his eyes, but he did it. He took them to captivity. They walked after him, and he walked to the main unit that he lost. When he came to his unit, the unit was shocked. They rubbed their eyes, they didn't believe. One Israeli soldier is leading after him thousands of Egyptian soldiers with their hands up, ready to go to captivity. So they took them to captivity and immediately made a research with the Egyptian officers. What happened here? How you gave up
for one Israeli soldier. And they answered, he was not alone. Together with him were thousands of angels, each one of them with a gun in his hands, ready to shoot us. And they said, we are ready to fight against Israeli soldiers. We are not ready to fight against the angels of God.
When you compare the two armies and see the size of the number of soldiers as well as the buildup of machinery, you know that it couldn't have possibly happened without some outside help. Well, if we look into the scripture, we find that Elisha also was surrounded by the enemy at one time. His servant said, what are we going to do? He said, Lord, open up his eyes. Suddenly his eyes were opened up to supernatural beings. And the same is true in this war as well. The story goes that the Egyptians were coming up onto the southern border of Israel when a hand actually came out of the sky. And as a result, they were fearful and they fled. And that was a story that has come out from the Egyptians, who said there was something that happened supernaturally.
All these stories is not mystical stories for books. This is reality in the life of Israel.
The Six-Day War was filled with bloody battles over the land that both sides claim as their own. When the conflict began, Syria controlled the Golan Heights, and Egypt had the Sinai Peninsula, including the Gaza Strip. By the end of the war, all that had changed. That's what makes our next story all the more mysterious.
Since 1948, Jerusalem, the center of the Jewish faith and holy to Christianity and Islam, has been a divided city. Israel controlled the western half of the city, and Jordan retained control of the eastern half, which was the old city. On June 5th, 6th and 7th, there had been fierce fighting all around the eastern flank of the old city. But on the morning of June the 7th, the third day of the war, the Jordanian guns fell silent. General Uzi Narkis of the Israeli Defense Force was leading the charge on the city. He tells us that on the fourth day, some kind of an airy calm came over the city. At the beginning, he thought that it was some kind of a trap. But the scouts told him that the city was in fact empty. The Jordanian army had left the night before, leaving all the equipment behind. And the Israel, without even shooting one bullet, the Israelis were able to enter into the city, taking the Temple Mount and reaching the Western Wall.
When Israeli soldiers rolled into the old city of Jerusalem, they couldn't believe their eyes. There before them was the Wailing Wall, the only remaining wall of the ancient Second Temple that had survived the region's punishing history. In 1948, the Arabs had sealed off the old city. The Jews had been unable to come to this place, the most important place in the world to these people. Here they could give thanks and pray to the God that had watched over them for so many thousands of years. Not all Israeli soldiers believed this. Some had little or no religious conviction in their hearts. But even the unbelievers realized something significant had happened.
Was there a special significance in Israel's miraculous conquest of these large tracts of land? The same land that ancient writings promised to Abraham's descendants? And was Bible prophecy fulfilled when Israel took possession of Jerusalem?
The most important factor of the Six-Day War was the fact that Jerusalem was united. Jerusalem has been overrun 20 times, but it was never divided until 1948. And many of the prophets talked about the unification of Jerusalem, which happened in the Six-Day War.
The fact that Israel regained much of the Promised Land as a result of the Six-Day War is significant, especially in terms of the fulfillment of ancient Bible prophecies. These writings tell us that the Jews would be scattered throughout the world on 3 separate occasions. They also predicted that each time the Jews would return to Jerusalem. Well, 2 of the 3 returns came to pass in biblical times, but it's the 3rd occasion that's most significant, and that began with Israel's reclaiming of Jerusalem in the Six-Day War.
Many Bible scholars believe that when the Israelis rolled into Jerusalem on June the 11th, it marked the beginning of the end times on earth. Now, in Bible prophecy, the end times refers to a period of cataclysmic natural disasters, famine, and war that would precede the end of the world. These events will lead up to one final conflict one horrific battle, Armageddon.
Is the present return of Israel the beginning of the last and ultimate regathering of the Jews in Jerusalem? Is it one more link in a long chain of events that will prepare the way for the end times? For many, the most immediate concern is the effect that the continuing unrest in the Middle East is having on the nations of the world, especially Russia. Recent events indicate that the sleeping Cold War giant has been awakened and is clearly jockeying for a position of authority in the Middle East today.
One of the reasons that Russia is interested in the Middle East is because of oil. The majority of the world's oil reserves are found there. In order to maintain itself as a world power, Russia wants to control that supply. The next logical step, of course, is that when the stability of the Middle East oil reserves are threatened, the world will react. We don't need to look any further than the Gulf War to see how true this is.
The long-term volatility of the situation in the Middle East means that war is always possible. And with the current turmoil that's brewing between the Israelis and the Palestinians, it seems closer than ever. If a full-scale war were to erupt, the United States would undoubtedly take Israel's side. But what about Russia? Would they take the same side they chose during the Six-Day War and come to the aid of the Arabs? And if a conflict erupts between nations that possess nuclear weapons, might we witness the destruction of the world as we now know it? In other words, the apocalypse?
When the Cold War ended and the Soviet bloc splintered, it didn't take long for its influence in the Middle East to recede. Then in the early 1990s, Russia decided to return to its traditional stance in the Middle East, pursuing an independent policy. In many cases, this involved supporting regimes that were regarded as rogue states by America. In other words, Russia's allies in the region became America's enemies.
With this type of foreign policy in place, there is little doubt that Russia would indeed take up arms against the nation of Israel and its Cold War enemy, the United States. But could this really lead to the apocalypse? The Bible says yes.
2,600 years ago, the prophet Ezekiel wrote of an invasion against Israel by an army from the far north. Ezekiel chapter 38 says that Gog and many nations with it will advance upon Israel. It will be a great horde, a mighty army, and they will be like a cloud that covers the land. Now the interesting thing about all this is that the leader of the enemy is identified in the prophecy as the Prince of Rosh. It doesn't take much of a leap to see that the word Rosh is Russia.
Interestingly enough, the Encarta-Desk Encyclopedia lists the word Gog as a synonym for giant. And if we look at a world map, we see that to the far north of Israel, one of the giants that remains is Russia. In recent years, attempts to bring lasting peace to the Middle East have continued, but more often than not, they crumble under the weight of the ancient conflict. On the other hand, Bible scholars argue that more and more of the ancient prophecies concerning Israel are being fulfilled. Does this mean that the Bible gives us a reliable roadmap for what to expect next in the region? And if it does, are we really headed for a battle the likes of which the world has never seen? Since its miraculous victory in the Six-Day War, Israel has maintained a tenuous hold over the ancient city on a hill. In fact, much of the land that the Israelis fought for during the conflict remains under their control. Will the battle between Jew and Arab continue to be waged in the streets of this holy place? Or will it eventually spread until all the nations of the world are locked in a fight to the finish? And if the Battle of Armageddon were to actually take place, would God's chosen people, the Jews, once again emerge as the miraculous victors? Perhaps only time will tell, but according to ancient prophecy, time may be running out.